Well, hey, good morning, everyone. It is good to be back. In case you're a guest, let me first introduce myself, and then I'll tell you what I mean. My name is Matthew Johnson. I'm the lead pastor here at the Tree. And we just got back, my wife and I, from Israel. So we were there for 10 days. It was an incredible experience. Honestly, it was a little bit surreal to be in the place that Jesus walked. And it's a very unique area in that some things have changed. There's some modernization in different spots, but then there's some things that are still the same from 2,000, even more longer ago. And so it was just an incredible trip. It was funny. One of the most common questions I got asked while I was there is, am I from the Middle East? And I was like, no, Detroit initially, and now from Lancaster. But it was just a great trip. And so I will let you know, in November of 2019, Mary and I are going to lead a team there, a trip there, for a group that want to go. It's going to be for 20 couples, married couples. And then the following year, we'll do another trip and open it up for everyone. And we hope to make that an annual thing where we take teams there that can go and experience the Holy Land. So we'll release that information next Sunday. And if you're interested, then you can sign up and be a part of that. All right, everyone, do me a favor. If you have a Bible or electronic device, please turn to John chapter 1, and I'm going to be there in just a moment. So last week, Pastor Michael continued in our series that's called Jesus Is, where we're looking at the idea of who Jesus was in relation to the example that he set for us as people. And Michael taught a very clear and powerful message that I want to continue today. So if you can view today's message as a continuation of last week, but I'm just going to take a moment and summarize what he taught, because I can actually summarize Michael's entire message in 2 statements. And the reason I can do that is that's actually what Michael did, okay? The first one is, his first point is that Jesus was a friend to everyone. And in that he said it without any type of explanation, in the sense of he wasn't qualifying it in any way. There's no loophole, there's no exception to the rule. What he clearly taught from Scripture is that Jesus was friends with people who were nothing like him. Jesus, being holy, being God, was still friends with people who were unholy, people who were broken by sin and rejected by culture. And so Jesus' heart was that he wanted to show love and acceptance to everyone. So from that, then, Michael taught the second point, is that if Jesus was a friend to everyone, then so should we. We should also be friends too. And again, he showed it in Scripture, very clearly taught. But here's what I think probably happens with that, is initially you hear a message like that, and if you have a heart of sensitivity inside of you, you respond. You think, yeah, I want that. I want to do that. I know love is better than hate. I know acceptance is better than rejection. I want to do that. But yet there's a tension that arises in you, especially for those who have conviction of a relationship with God and faith and an understanding of his instruction for our lives, that you wonder, how does that practically play out? Because there's a tension in our culture that I think all of us live in. So I want to kind of hit pause, and I want to explain this tension so that you understand why this creates a struggle inside of us. In our culture, I think it's clearly that our culture is trying to drive us into one of 2 camps. The first camp is the one that is based on a conviction of your own belief system. So what I would call this is the truth camp. I'm not saying what they believe is true. This is based around their own version of truth. And there can be some good to this, but there can be a lot of bad to it. But in this camp, it's the individual who thinks, I have my own belief system. I have my way of thinking. I have my way of living. And I am convinced that it is right, it is true. And every relationship in my life is going to be in directly relation to what I believe. And so if you agree with me, we can be friends. If you don't agree with me, then we can't be friends. There's going to be tension there because I know what's right. And so this group locks themselves into the idea of defending truth. Again, it could be true or could not be true, but to them it is. And so they have this conviction, I have to do what is right because of my convictions. Okay, so this one group is the truth group. But then our culture also has something that is in very much the polar opposite of this. And this group actually is the opposite, and I'm going to call this the love group. Again, I'm not necessarily saying this is the love group, but they view themselves as the love group. And I'll give one sentence to describe their viewpoint. It's, you do you, and I'll do me. I'm not going to judge you. You don't judge me. I'm going to, not only that, I'm not even going to judge you, but I'm going to go above and beyond that. I'm going to affirm what you do. Whatever is your conviction, whatever is your belief system, I'm going to support you. You have to decide what's right for you. I decide what's right for me, and it's all good, right? And again, I'm not trying to be a smart aleck and make fun of either of these groups. I realize at times my voice very much is that voice, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? The voice that just comes across like you want to smack it sometimes. You guys know what I'm talking about? How many of you have ever thought, I want to smack Matthew? I can't believe you actually raised your hands. That was totally a trick. All right, so everyone that raised their hand, I will meet you at the altar at the end of service. We're going to work through some issues. No, but I'm really not trying to make fun of either of these groups. There is one group that has a conviction that I have to live my life according to truth. There's another group that in their mind I have to live my life according to love. But then there's this caveat, there's a problem. And the problem is in the middle of it is Christians. And what I'm about to say is going to come across as extremely arrogant, and I don't mean it to be. And even a couple of weeks ago I talked about this and explained why this isn't really an arrogant statement. But let me say it and then I'll kind of explain it. As Christians, we have this conviction. We're right. So therefore, everyone else is wrong. The truth is, every belief system teaches that concept. They're right, everyone else is wrong. But as Christians, we believe that we are right because God has explained to us that we are right. And so therefore, every other person is wrong. But when I say right, I'm not just simply talking about right on some practical issues. We believe we are right in every way. We are morally right. We are ethically right. We allow our views to shape how we view other things. So even in the area of politics, we are politically right. We are relationally right. We are spiritually right. And so all of this leads to this one deep conviction. We are also eternally right in the sense of our belief systems impact how we act, and that's going to impact how we spend eternity, whether we're going to spend it with God or apart from God. And so we have this deep conviction in our lives that what we're called to do is a very specific set of standards. And so in this, there's a part of us that looks at the truth group and we think we have to go that way. We have the Word of God. We have His instructions. It's right. Everything else is wrong. And so it's easy for us to be drawn into this group to say, okay, so what we have to do is defend our beliefs. Defend what is true. Defend what is right. Condemn what's not. But then also as Christians, we know clearly the Scriptures where Jesus tells us that we are called to love. He actually says, this is how the whole world will know that you are my disciples. Not if you have a lot of truth or knowledge, but he says the world will know you're my disciples if you love one another. He even said to them at the very end of his ministry here on earth, he says, a new commandment I give you, love one another. And so we have this other conviction that we're called to be people who love each other. And so we don't know how it plays out. How can we honor the truth of what God has called us to do, but how can we also love the people around us? And so we're stuck in the middle. And Michael's message last week, I think, creates that tension where we hear about loving our neighbors, and Jesus loved everyone and was friends with everyone, and we're called to do that. But how can we do that and still hold to our convictions? How can we do that and yet still love? And so we don't know how to respond. But what if this idea of truth as our culture defines it, what if that's not what God had in mind? And what if this idea of love as our culture defines it is not what God had in mind? What if it's something completely different? And so here's the good news, and it really is good news. Jesus came for this specific purpose, to model for us what it means to properly live out in this tension, where we can live a life that on one hand honors the truth of what God has communicated to us, but on the other hand shows love to the world. Jesus had a disciple, John, who was actually considered to be the best friend of Jesus. In the scriptures, Jesus had the large groups that followed him, then he had the inner circle of the 12, and then even within the 12, he had 3, And then within the three, he had one that many consider his best friend. His name was John. And John wrote a biography of Jesus, what we call the fourth gospel. And in this, John talked about, he quoted some of the things that Jesus taught. He gave an account of things he witnessed Jesus do. But then in the beginning of the book, he actually explained some fundamental understanding of who Jesus was so that his audience would have a proper perspective as they would read everything that came after. And the first 14 to 18 verses of John is, in my opinion, is the greatest thing ever written about Jesus. Without exaggeration, I could teach an entire year, take a whole year just to teach the first 14 to 18 verses of John. It's incredible. And where John begins is he speaks in a kind of poetic language. In the very first verse, he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And he's, again, using poetic language to illustrate this point. As we will learn in verse 14, when John says, "In the beginning was the Word," he's talking about Christ, about Jesus, that he has always been. He was not created. He is fully God, eternal in every way. And so he says, in the beginning was Jesus, was the Christ, was God. In the beginning, he was. And he was eternal. And in the beginning, he was for God. He was connected to God because he is God. But I love the imagery that John uses. He describes him as the Word. And the reason this is important is what he was saying is that Jesus is the perfect reflection of what God desires for our lives. See, let me kind of give it to you in earthly perspective. If you were to have right now in your own life your own desire, something that you wanted to communicate to someone else, you had an idea, a preference, a desire, what's the best way to communicate what you're thinking or feeling? So for some, you would say actions, because we even have that clever phrase that we use, that actions speak louder than words. I don't personally think that's completely accurate. I actually would define it this way. I think actions speak louder than words when actions contradict words. But the truth is that actions are powerful, but when actions agree with your words, it's really powerful. When you speak something and then also act it, those things together make a powerful truth, the way to communicate truth. Let me give you an example. Mary and I, my wife, when I was 14, I was a freshman in high school, we started to talk in a romantic sense. I liked her. She was a year older than me. That's right. And so I started to talk with her. I invited her initially to go to a school event that we had, and she went with me. And then after that, we just started to hang out. And I never did the traditional thing where I went to her and said, "Will you be my girlfriend?" For some reason, it always just seemed like super cheesy to me. And so I wasn't going to do that. And so instead, we just hung out. And what became obvious to everyone is that we were more than just friends. So every single day in between classes, we would talk to each other. When school was out, we would walk together down the hallway. I would carry her bag. We would go out as friends because I wasn't driving yet, so I wasn't allowed to date individually, but we'd go out as friends. We'd always sit next to each other. I mean, there were so many evidences that she was my girlfriend, except one thing. It was never spoken out loud. So actions all proved one thing, but there was nothing verbally that confirmed it. Until that glorious day, the one day that Mary was introducing me to someone, and she said to them, "This is my boyfriend, Matthew." Oh, man, I was like, that's right. I am her boyfriend. And from that point on, I was like walking on the hallways. This is my girlfriend, Mary. This is my girlfriend, Mary. Why? Because it was now vocalized. In that moment, behavior and words work together to communicate a powerful truth. And I believe this is the idea of what John was communicating. He was saying, in the beginning was the Word, God, the perfect reflection of the heart of God. And then he'll say in verse 14, and the Word became flesh. And what he's communicating is that Jesus came as the perfect representation of all that God desired for our lives. And so Jesus came, and he didn't just live the example, the perfect example, he also taught the perfect example. John would go on and say in verse 2, he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him, so in Jesus, was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I mean, what he's saying is, understand this. Jesus is God. He's eternal. But he is also the hope of the world. He is life. To everyone who is dying, he is life. To everyone who's in darkness, he is the light. And in the end, he overcomes the darkness. Jesus wins. He is the hope of the world. And so then John will then go on to communicate. He'll start to talk about John the Baptist over the next few verses. And then he comes back, and in verse 14, he says a very interesting truth about Jesus. He says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father." And then he describes Jesus this way: full of grace and truth. Now, wait a second. When I hear that, I'm like, wait. Which one is it? Because as John is describing it, Jesus is fully grace and yet fully truth. And in my mind, it has to be one or the other. Because Jesus comes and he is fully truth. He never sins. He's the standard of perfection. He's the standard of holiness. Everyone else is nothing like him, so he can never compromise. So in my mind, it's really easy for me to say, well, obviously, he's full of truth. But yet he says, no, he's not just full of truth. He's also full of grace. And in my mind, I struggle because I think, no, it has to be. He's sometimes grace and sometimes truth. Or maybe he's half grace and half truth. Maybe it's a blend of it, but John's like, no. Jesus came and he did something really, really, really unique. He was always grace, always truth. And in my mind, I go, that doesn't work. I don't understand it because I can't operate that way. There are times I have to turn on the truth, and there are times I can turn on grace. Because I think about it, I mean, Jesus, when he came, no one was like him. He should have come and just simply went around and condemned everyone. He should have, if he's going to be full of truth, he just walks around and goes, sinner, 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 guilty, guilty, guilty. But yet he comes and he says just the opposite. You're welcome to be with me. You're welcome to be in a relationship. And he invited everyone in, consistently showed grace. And then in my mind, I go, but if you're showing grace, I mean, isn't that condoning all their behavior? And I said, no. He was able to do both, fully grace and also fully truth. And so my mind goes, how is that possible? So I want to show you some examples of how Jesus made it possible. I want to show you 4. Here's the first. In Matthew 9, it says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. So we have to pause here, and many of you understand the tension with the tax collectors, but we always have guests here, so I want to kind of bring you in so you know exactly the context. In this culture 2,000 years ago, tax collectors were hated by everyone. And the reason that they were hated, specifically in the Jewish culture, is that in order to become a tax collector, the path that most of them went down is they sold their land. And this isn't just any land. This is the promised land given by God to the Israelites. So they would sell their land to get money, to pay off a Roman official to get the position of tax collector, to then turn around and tax their own people to give money to Rome, and then on top of that, to go above and beyond unethically, to skim off of it so that they can make themselves rich. So they sold their land, they rejected God, they rejected their own people, they were thieves, and so everybody hated the tax collectors. And so in this story, Jesus is walking down the street and he comes across a tax collector, a man who's actively in this role. His name is Matthew. And Jesus says to him, follow me. And so Matthew gets up and follows him. Verse 10. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? So, I mean, this is really kind of a unique story. Jesus goes and says, Matthew, follow me. Matthew's like, okay, where are we going? And Jesus is like, we're going to your house. You're going to make me dinner. And you're going to invite your friends. And not only that, I'm going to invite my friends to join. And so they go there, and Matthew is most likely only friends with tax collectors because it's the only people that can tolerate him. And then other sinners, people who have rejected any form of religion, they're not honoring God. And so all of them are there. And then in the middle of this party is Jesus and all of Jesus' disciples. And they're all eating together. And so the Pharisees, which are religious leaders, are walking by and they witness this, and it troubles them. And here's what's easy to do. It's easy for us as Christians to always criticize and judge the Pharisees because they did so many wrong things. But in this moment, I really do think their perspective is understandable. They're struggling with it. And so they pose the question, why is Jesus having dinner and hanging out with tax collectors and sinners? Because from their perspective, here's Jesus, who's supposed to represent holiness. He's supposed to be a man of God, and so in that sense, he's supposed to be truth, and yet he's hanging out with sinners. So from their perspective, by hanging out with sinners, he's condoning their behavior. What the Pharisees think that Jesus should do is to get up and to condemn them, to say, you're sinners, you need to change, and then once they change, so they need to change first, align with truth, and then they can be in relationship. And so they're confused by this. Is Jesus condoning their behavior? Is he hanging out with them just saying, hey, it's all good, you guys can party, you can do whatever you want, I'm here to say that God loves you no matter what you do? Is that what God is saying? And so in response to this, Jesus hears this question and he responds. Verse 12. But when Jesus heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. I love the beautifully awkward moment this is. Jesus is hanging out with them. The Pharisees go, why is he hanging out with them? I don't understand this. And Jesus, in defense, stands up and goes, I'll tell you why. It's not the healthy who need the doctor, it's the sick. And how I picture this might not be accurate at all, but how I picture it is that the tax collectors and the sinners were like, that's right, Jesus, you tell them. Wait a second. Yeah. Do you get what Jesus just said? He just said everyone he's hanging out with is sick. He just said everyone he's hanging out with are sinners. He first gave grace saying, I want to connect. I want to be in relationship. I want to talk to you. I want to hang out with you. But in the same moment, he doesn't compromise and say, and it's okay however you want to live. But in this moment, he goes, no, I love them because I love them. But here's the truth. They're sick. They're broken. The same way that the Pharisees are sick and they're broken. What Jesus was modeling is he did not compromise either one of them. Full of grace. I love them because I love them. I hang out with them because I hang out with them. I'm welcoming them because I welcome them. But I'm also going to tell them that their behavior is not ideal. Their behavior is broken. Their behavior needs to change. Let me give you another example. Example 2. In John chapter 8, it gives us the account that one day Jesus was coming from the Mount of Olives. And it's fascinating because I was just there last week to see this area that's very much unchanged, where there's some olive trees, and it's just a really cool location. But Jesus was there and he was teaching. And the crowds were following him and they were there listening. And then all of a sudden in this process, the religious leaders actually caught a woman in the act of adultery. And so they grab her out of this very vulnerable place, they bring her in front of everyone, and they throw her in front of Jesus, and they ask Jesus the question. Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. According to the law of Moses, which is the law of God, she can be stoned to death. What should we do? And so it says that Jesus just knelt down, and he started to write in the sand. And he was just writing in the sand. It doesn't tell us what he wrote. But as he's writing in the sand, they just keep pestering him. They keep asking, Jesus, what are we to do? We're supposed to stone her, right? Do you want us to stone her? And so he just kept writing, and it says that Jesus finally stopped, and he looked up, and he said, okay, here's what we'll do. Whichever one of you has never sinned in your life, you be the first one to throw a stone, and then everyone else can follow, and you can stone her to death. And it says that Jesus just went back to writing. And the account goes on, and it says this, and when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you." So in this moment, Jesus just showed her incredible grace. You could actually say he showed her life-saving grace. Because of his perspective and the words that he just shared, these men left and did not stone her to death. But Jesus didn't want to just save her physically. He wanted to save her spiritually. And he says to her, "Where are they? Is anyone here condemning you?" And she said, "No, no." And he goes, "Well, I want you to know, I don't condemn you either." If the story just stops there, there can be some confusion with it. Because on the surface, it could look like Jesus maybe is condoning her behavior. Maybe he's saying it's not that big of a deal. And I'm not trying to be a total smart aleck, but it could almost communicate like Jesus, like, yeah, adultery, it's not that big of a deal. But instead, before she leaves, Jesus says one more thing. And what he says is, he says, "Go, and from now on, sin no more." I mean, what he's saying to her is, understand this. Your behavior was sin. Your behavior was destructive. Your behavior hurt you. Your behavior hurts the community. I mean, he's communicating the destructiveness of sin. He's saying, don't live that way. Don't go on in that same pattern. And I don't think Jesus is simply saying it because he's like, hey, don't do that because they might catch you again and kill you. He's saying, don't do that because that's not the best way to live. And can you imagine this woman's perspective? Do you think she gave the words of Jesus some weight after he just saved her life? I would imagine anything he had to say, she would listen to. And so Jesus, after he gave the context of grace, he saves her life, he then says some truth to her. Listen, don't go and sin. That's not the best way to live. Let me give you example 3. In Luke chapter 22, on the last night that Jesus was here on earth before he was arrested and crucified, he was prophesying about an event that would happen later on that night into the morning. And he was challenging one of his closest friends, a man by the name of Simon or Peter. He went by both names. And Simon Peter was also part of the inner circle of Jesus, one of his closest 3 friends. And Jesus says something to him that's absolutely fascinating because in this one statement that he makes to him, he gives him both truth and grace. He said, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." So he's telling them, Peter, you're going to fail tonight. And Peter's response is like, "Oh, no, you got it all wrong, Jesus. I'm your boy. I'm the one that you can count on. I'm here to the end." And Peter said to him, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death." Jesus said, "I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me." So here, get this context. I mean, it's powerful. What Jesus communicates, no one communicates like this. Jesus is prophesying about a future event that's going to take place that night into the early mornings. And here's what he's saying, "Peter, I recognize you're going to let me down. I'm going to get arrested. I'm going to be in my greatest time of need. And instead of being loyal to me and following me, instead, 3 times you're going to be asked if you're one of my followers, and 3 times you're going to deny that you even knew me. When I'm in my greatest time of need, you're going to let me down." Now, if anyone else of us is communicating that, I'm confident we would have the same response, that this would be the moment that the relationship with Peter ends. And I don't think, if Jesus rejected him, I don't think any of us would look down on Jesus. If Jesus would have said to him, "Peter, tonight, in my time of greatest need, you're going to let me down. You're not going to have my back. And you've seen me over the last 3 years. You know me. You know my character. You know I'm God. You've seen the miracles. You've seen the grace that I've given you over and over. And I've only asked you one thing, be loyal to me. And tonight you're going to betray me. So Peter, know this, our relationship is over." Would anyone judge Jesus? Would anyone go like, that's unfair? No, we'd all look at that and go, yeah, that makes sense. That's truth. But he goes, "Peter, let me tell you, you're going to mess up tonight. You're going to betray me at my time of greatest need. And I want you to know Satan has already asked that he can destroy you. He knows you're going to be at your lowest emotionally, relationally, spiritually, and he wants to sift you like wheat. He just wants to take you out. And Jesus goes, here's my response. Truth is, you're going to let me down, but here's my response, grace. I have prayed for you that you will be redeemed. I have prayed for you that you will turn back. And this is how much I love you. When you turn back, I want you to be the leader of everyone else. Not only do I still have a place for you, it's going to be the place on top. I want you to lead your other brothers. Who communicates like this? Jesus, full of grace and truth. He didn't compromise anything, didn't compromise truth, didn't compromise grace. So then there's example 4 that I'll share with you at the very end of the message. So the question I have is, why does Jesus act this way? Here's the reason. Love compels him. Love compels him. If you are motivated by love, the only response you can have toward people is grace and truth. There is no other way. See, if you love people, biblical love, committed to their betterment, then in love you have to extend grace. You have to be patient in the process. You can't demand perfection. You have to understand that people are broken and people will struggle. And Jesus understood this. He didn't come with any type of delusional way of thinking. He knew that humanity was still devastated by sin and would be until the end, where he comes back a second time to take us all to heaven. And so in love, it compels him to extend grace over and over, because that is the only pathway that will ever lead people into truth. Grace is the pathway that leads to truth. And so love compels, and we get that. But the flip side of it is just equally as true. That if you love someone, love compels you to speak truth into their lives. Why? Because all the sins of our lives are lies. And if you love someone, you will confront that, recognizing that sin kills. Sin destroys. The best example I've used over and over in my preaching is this. Imagine at the edge of this stage is a cliff that if you fall over is certain death. And imagine you have a friend that is blindly walking backwards toward that cliff. What does love compel you to do? Does love compel you to go, hey, I don't want to inconvenience our friendship. I don't want to make it awkward. I don't want to say anything that might create tension, and now we're not going to know how to respond around each other. No. If your friend is walking blindly toward a cliff, love compels you to go, stop. Stop. I love you enough to create tension. I love you enough to make this awkward. I love you enough to tell you that if you follow down that pathway, it's going to destroy you. If you go down that pathway, it's going to hurt your marriage. If you go down that pathway, it's going to hurt your family. If you go down that pathway, it's going to destroy your reputation. If you go down that pathway, it's a cheap imitation of life. Love compels. And this is what Jesus modeled. The reason he always showed grace and always showed truth is because love compelled him to do this. But then here's the second reason that Jesus always operated this way. Is because without each other, grace and truth become completely different things. What I mean by that is they have to always go together. See, I mean, kind of break it down a little bit more. Without grace, truth becomes legalistic falsity. And I know that's kind of a fancy way to word it, but what I mean by that is without grace, the truth as we understand it actually becomes something different. The truth that we embrace in our lives, you have to get this principle, okay? The truth that we're talking about is a truth created by Jesus, defined by Jesus. And the truth of Jesus always has grace connected to it. So when you remove grace from the truth of the scriptures, you have something different. And what you have is information, and most often it becomes your truth, your information, your legalism. And this is what has happened in the church world, where Christians have removed grace from truth, and unfortunately, they now have information, and they're using it as a truth hammer to beat the world. And it's the reason why our reputation as Christians are so bad in our culture, is because we now are more known for what we stand against than for love. When people think of Christians, they think of people that are protesting against. Because why? Because we have the truth. And the truth means this, and I have to hold on to my convictions, and I can't compromise. Then I have to embrace this political idea, and I have to go against this moral idea, and I have to go against this ethical idea. And we just use truth to beat and pound on people because we've removed the part that makes it safe. We've removed grace from it. And so it's become something completely different. But then the flip of that is also true. When we remove truth from grace, what it simply becomes is affirmation. And that could be the most unloving thing to do. What I mean by that, truthfully, if you remove truth, then there's no need for grace. If I remove truth, everyone can determine what is good or what is bad, and they can do their own standard. But what happens is, if you remove truth, then what happens is I just simply affirm your behavior. I tell you that whatever you do is okay, whatever you do is good, but the truth is that could be the most unloving thing to do. Because as I'm telling you, your behavior is great, you might be walking backwards blindly toward a cliff that will destroy you. And our culture is telling us that that's the most loving thing to do. And Jesus says, no, it's actually not. The most loving thing to do is to hold on to truth and grace and never try to separate them. And so when we look at Jesus, what he modeled over and over is this truth, that you can do both. You can be fully grace and fully truth. So you might think, Matthew, how does that play out? So I want to take a moment and tell you a personal and practical example, something that's happened in my own life. I don't think I have to qualify this every time I say it, but I will just to be safe. I never tell these stories to lift myself up. I just tell you these stories so that I can practically explain it to you. But a few years ago, I started to do CrossFit. I started to work out. I was physically feeling unhealthy. I was having migraines more often. My doctor told me I needed to exercise, so I tried CrossFit. My brother had been bothering me, pestering me about it. You got to try it. You'll love it. So I went to True.Fit here in town, and I started doing CrossFit. And another reason why I wanted to do it was that I also recognized in my own life I didn't know anyone who had different viewpoints of life than I did. I moved to Ohio to take the position here at the church. And so all my relationships that were developed here, almost all of them were with Christians, people who viewed the world just like me. I didn't know anyone that had other belief system. So I wanted to be in an environment where I could be around people who had different views than me, honestly, so that I could learn and also encourage others. So I started doing CrossFit. And immediately I started to develop these relationships, and it was this incredible place. The people were wonderful. I loved it. It reminded me of church in the sense of there was this real deep community. People encouraged each other, and we were like, getting healthy together. But then I started to also meet people that were dramatically different than me. And so this one day I was in the gym, and I was actually sitting on the ground stretching, getting ready for the class, and this guy walks through the door. And I share all of this with his permission. This guy walks through the door, and the first word out of his mouth is a cuss word. And he says it loudly. He just walks in and yells a cuss word. And I'm telling you, the cuss word is a cuss word, okay? You guys get what I'm saying? He said the big one. And he just yells it out. And I'm sitting there, and I just looked up at him, and I remember it vividly as I can, like it happened today. I looked at him, and my thought was, I'm going to hate this guy. Because he was nothing like me. And almost immediately, I felt like God said to me, no, actually, you're going to love this guy. And I didn't feel like God was saying, no, you're going to love him. So that was like, oh, great. I have to love this guy. It wasn't like that. I felt like God was saying, no, actually, you guys are going to be friends. You're going to love this guy. But man, he was nothing like me. I mean, he was honestly, he was just really foul. We didn't seem like common interests. I'm a lot older than him. And it was just kind of weird. But yet I just felt like, you know what? Hey, he's not like me. This is why I want to be here. And so I just started talking with him. Started hanging out with him. Every time that we had class together, I'd go out of my way to talk to him, get to know him. And what I discovered was I really did like him. He's a funny guy, super kind-hearted guy, but just different. And as I talked with him, it became clear to me, initially, from my perspective, that he wanted nothing to do with God. He had had some bad religious experiences in his past, kind of had a bad taste about just the idea of religion. And so in my mind, I thought, he'll never go to church, but hey, I still like him. I'm still going to be friends with him. We can just be friends. And so we continued to hang out, continued to connect. Every once in a while, I would invite him to church. I would just say, hey, we're having this, whatever, Christmas service. I'd love to have you come, and never took me up on it. So as we came closer to the launch of our new building, I once again invited him. And what I didn't know was at the same time, this is his testimony, at the same time, he started to feel like in his life that God was bringing all these situations in his life to get his attention, to get him back to church. He told me, he said, like all these things, so many things started happening that he said he sat down with one of his other friends and told them, and his other friend said to him, you would be a fool to ignore all of that. So one of the examples he gave me, which made me laugh, was a couple that goes to our church, Mick and Molly Harper. So Molly's actually my assistant here at the church. But they were talking with him, and he admires Mick. Like, he thinks Mick's a good guy. And so he said, like, Mick, I want to be like you, made some kind of half joke, half serious comment. And he said, what do I need to do to be like you? And Molly was off in the distance, and she heard, and she said, go to church. And if you know Molly, that's her personality. And he said he saw it as another sign from God. And so I had been inviting him, Mick had been inviting him. So I think either the first or the second week we were in our new building, he came. And initially he came and he sat with them, and then he came the next week. And he came the next week, and he started coming, not because someone invited him, but he started to come on his own. And sometimes he would sit with people, because we have a lot of people from the gym that attend here, but then other times he would just sit by himself. And as I was teaching, every time I would just see him. I would see him out in the crowd, and I was always encouraging him. I'm like, oh, that's cool that he's coming. And so week after week, he was coming. Excuse me, 2 Sundays ago, he was sitting right there. At the end of service, I said, hey, does anyone want to dedicate their life to Jesus? And I told him, I said, hey, it's going to be the most terrifying thing you've ever done. My guess is your heart's going to be beating, you're going to feel sick. And he later told me, he said, this is exactly how I felt. But 2 weeks ago, when I had that invitation, he stood up and he surrendered his life to Jesus. And on this past Friday, I got back into town from Israel on Thursday, and on Friday I went into the gym to work out. And I was coming in actually at the end of a class. I was going to do the open gym time, and he was there, and he said, hey, I'll work out with you. I said, great. And so we worked out together, and at the end, we were the only ones in the gym besides Jimmy, one of the owners. I'll come back to Jimmy in just a moment. And so we just started having a spiritual conversation. And as we were talking, he was talking about that day and all these things that had happened in his life. And as we were talking, I said, hey, let me tell you. And I just started to speak truth to him. I started telling him, God's going to change your life. And he's going to ask you to give up things that are really important to you. And he's going to ask you to do difficult things. The way that Jesus worded it is that you have to die to yourself. I mean, it's a really aggressive way that he worded it so that you would understand it's going to be a difficult process. And he was open to it and receiving it. Why? Because he knew that I loved him. I didn't love him as a means to an end. I loved him because I loved him, because he's a friend. And I wasn't the only one that loved him. He actually said to me, he goes, when God was drawing me, he said, what happened was I looked around the gym, and all these people had something that I could see, something that I desired that I didn't have. And he said, I realized every single one of them went to your church. And he said, it just started to draw me. Like, I thought, I want that. And so we connected, and he said, hey, this conversation was great. I said, I enjoyed it too. And he goes, I think I said to him, would you be willing to do this more often, like getting together once a week, and let's just talk about life? He goes, I'd love that. And you know what? His journey, his faith journey is going to look different than mine. I've had a big head start on him, to say the least. And he might embrace everything. He might not embrace stuff. But you know what? No matter what choice he makes, I still love him. I'm still going to give grace to that process. And here's the cool part of the story, all right? So while we're talking in the gym, Jimmy, the co-owner of our gym, is in there. He's putting together a piece of equipment that they just bought. And he walks by and he hollers out to him and he says, hey, you got to join a Connect group. It will change your life. See, let me tell you Jimmy's story. So a few years ago, I started doing CrossFit. And I went into the gym, and one day Jimmy knew that I was a pastor, and he asked me a question about the Bible. So the next time I saw him, I bought him a study Bible, and I put a reading plan in it, and I just gave it to him. I said, here, this is a great translation. You'll understand it. Here's a great reading plan just to get your faith journey started. Let me know if you have any questions. And so Jimmy and I sat down, and I still remember we sat down in the other part of the gym, and he just asked me some Bible questions, and we started to connect. And a few years ago, I invited Jimmy to come to church for Easter, and he came. He's come ever since. Jimmy was on our production team, and he was actually the individual that brought my table and the TV out today. He's an active part of our church. Let me tell you the rest of the story. So Jimmy has a partner. His name is Brandon. So a few years ago, I started CrossFit. And Brandon and I started talking, and we became friends. And Jimmy and I became friends. And we started to just talk and hang out and talk about life. And it was something just more than just a casual friendship. Like, we became good, close, personal friends. And so I invited him to church on Easter, and he came the same Sunday as Jimmy. They actually came together and their families. And at that time, I didn't know it, but Brandon's wife was a part of our church. And so they came on Easter, and they've come ever since. And now Brandon was on stage today. He was playing bass in our band, an active part of our church. He's also on our youth ministry team. And when I look back on it, these two guys, Jimmy and Brandon, have become some of my closest friends. It is rare a day goes by that we don't text each other, because we love each other. And I loved them before they became Christians, and I loved them after they became Christians. It was never a means to an end. I loved them because I loved them. And that's what Jesus has modeled for us. He loves us because he loves us. And in our lives, if we don't love people for the sake of loving people, we should never have the right then to try to speak truth into their lives. What Jesus modeled is grace leads the way for truth. Let me give you the final example of what Jesus did, the fourth example. 2,000 years ago, Jesus went to the cross to die for our sins. And the reason that Jesus did this was to model both truth and grace. On one side, our sins had to be punished. God is just. He can't just turn it off. It's who he is. It's his nature. Sin demands the wrath of God. It demands death. And so God held on to truth. Jesus went to the cross to satisfy the demands of our sin. That is truth. But Jesus also went to the cross to take our place so that we don't have to die. That's grace. He gave the most perfect, vivid example that he is truth and grace. And what he's calling us to do is to love the same way. So here's the question for you. Are you willing to love the way that Jesus has loved? Because I'll tell you this, and I need you to hear me this, because I want to say this as boldly and bluntly as I can. The way of holding on to truth and hammering the world with truth, that way is not working. But the way of love always will. And so when we will be people who will love first, not as a means to an end, but love for the sake of loving, we will get relationships, an opportunity to connect, so that we can then give them truth, the greatest gift we can ever give, the truth about who Jesus is. And this is the strategy that Jesus has given every one of us. Will you stand and let me pray for you? Jesus, you loved us when we were unlovable. You pursued us when we were actively running away from you. There cannot be a more vivid example of grace. And in our lives, you have been so patient to love us and give us grace as we continue to mess up over and over again. But in that grace, you've never compromised. You still speak truth. Never to shame us, never to guilt us. You speak truth to guide us into a deeper understanding of love. And so what I pray is you help us to first receive your grace, receive your truth, and then to turn around and to give that grace and truth into every relationship in our lives. Help us to seek out people who are nothing like us so that we can love them just for the sake of loving them, the way that you did. And then as you give us opportunity, give us the courage to speak truth in love, knowing that your way is the best way to live. And we're believing that through our obedience and trust of you, you're going to draw a lot more people into a relationship with you, the greatest gift that we've ever received. So Jesus, we pray this in your powerful name. Amen.